Good morning. Good to see each and every one of you that chose to be with us this morning. Welcome. This is the auditorium class for the adults, and we are studying the book of Philippians. If you want to be turning there, we will do a little bit of review and then pick up where we left off and work our way through Philippians chapter 4. Arguably one of the more familiar sections in the book we will spend time on this morning. I do want to review ever so briefly and orient you with a very simple outline that I made that if it's helpful, great. If not, you can just dismiss it. But if you organize the chapter in just a way that you might remember it, you could think that the first few verses deal with what we're calling God's plea. And this is a plea for two individuals, two women who are in some sort of conflict that's addressed generically, known to the audience presumably, of these two women that are having some sort of conflict. And so the plea is a plea for unity, which happens to be a pervasive theme among Paul's writing to almost all of the churches that he addresses. And then we see God's peace, where we'll spend much of our time this morning in what are very familiar verses, where we're reminded not to be anxious, but that we have an opportunity to receive a peace that passes understanding. And then the next section, verse 10 through verse 13 of chapter 4, we could call this God's power. The most familiar verse, or one of them, being verse 13. This strength that God provides. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me or gives me the strength. And then the final section, if we're making a little simple outline, would be God's provision. And in this section, Paul addresses how Epaphroditus has come and brought provisions or supplies, and then reminds them that God will supply you all your needs. And so that'll be the final section when we get to it. So there's your little simple, elementary, working outline of chapter 4. Now, last week we dealt with this first section, God's plea, and we looked at these two women, Euodia and Syntyche, and their conflict, whatever it was. And they were addressed by name. I don't know precisely why, or if we can say for certain who these women were, but we could argue they were some of the initial converts there at Philippi. Some of the initial converts that are mentioned back in Acts chapter 16, as Paul on his missionary journey comes in and preaches the gospel first to a group of women praying by the river there. And these two women may be prominent in that they were some of the original members of this local body. Don't know that for certain, but they're mentioned by name and been known to everyone, relatively small group. They are encouraged to be of the same mind. Now, this is an encouragement that Paul gives often here to the brethren at Philippi, but also we could note many other occasions where this was a central theme or occasion of him writing. Think about Corinth. I mean, I've heard there are divisions among you, and he's talking about that almost throughout the whole book. Same thing within Romans, where there's this dynamic of Jew and Gentile that's addressed numerous times, and they're encouraged to be of the same mind. There's this mention of the need for gentleness, and we talked a little bit about that last week, that this is one of the attributes or temperaments or characteristics of a Christian. The servant of God must be, among other things, gentle and patient and in humility correcting those who are in opposition, able to teach. And that type of attribute does not necessarily come natural. And so they are encouraged to give attention to that gentleness for the sake of them being able to be of the same mind and work together. For whatever reason, they were struggling to work together. And again, this need for unity, again, a perpetual theme, not only in Paul's writing, but in the concern of, Jesus. I think one of the greatest prayers recorded in the Bible is that of John 17. And again, the pervasive theme in that prayer is a unity. And so we talked about that last week, and that's where we ended. Now, let's get to this next section that I know is very familiar. I imagine everyone in the room has read these verses, heard these verses, probably heard a lesson, probably heard a sermon, saw some of these verses stitched on a pillow, set them to memory, recited them to yourself in times of anxiety. I know these are familiar verses. However, I want to unpack it for a few minutes and give some thought to some practical application, hopefully, and a way that we can kind of remember these verses. I've organized them with 3 basic points, and so hopefully that'll be helpful too. Drop down and read these verses with me. We'll pick up in verse 6 of Philippians 4. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your request be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there's any virtue, if there's anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. The things which you learned and received and heard and saw in me, these do, and the God of peace will be with you. So I have taken this very familiar section about peace. I won't ask you, raise your hand if you'd like peace. I mean, obviously we would. I don't think that anyone would say, nah, I don't want it. I'd prefer conflict and unrest and uncertainty and fear and doubt and insecurities. That's what I want. Nobody does. Everybody wants peace. I had an interesting conversation, one that I have often with people who will come to me and struggle with their feelings. And I think that's something that we all have to navigate. Our thoughts and our feelings that, well, are just part of the experience of life and ebb and flow with circumstances. But they came to me and said something that's familiar, that someone has told me before. It's not the first time I've ever heard someone say that, but they said, I really am struggling because I don't feel saved. And so we began a conversation, and I started it like I often do. I asked, well, what does it feel like to be saved? And their response was, peace. I thought that was an interesting response. And so we began to unpack, why do you not feel at peace? And we began to explore some of the things in their life and some of their feelings, and we talked about Bible verses, and I won't go into the particulars of that. But I thought it was interesting that that person said to me, when I asked, and usually the response is, well, I don't know, because people say, well, I don't feel saved. And I said, well, what does saved feel like? Usually they say, well, I don't know. I said, well, let's explore that. But this time they said, it feels like peace. I don't know, that just kind of hit me, kind of struck me. There's some truth in that. This peace that we have that God provides. And that's what we're talking about here. And what we see in this is, well, our part. I talk about that often, especially when we think about salvation, for instance. If you think about salvation, there's God's part, obviously. We've been saved by grace. But then there's our part, right? Through what? Faith. That's our part, right? God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son. That's what God did. What's our part? He who believes, right? So we have these two sides of the coin, what God does and what we're obligated or responsible to do, or our living faith, or our response, or our obedience, whatever we want to call it. Well, peace is the same way. God wants to provide us peace. Listen very carefully. But we have to do our part. And I think that's what these verses kind of hammer home, and I put it in 3 points. What are the 3 things we could say were our part in receiving the peace? Well, the first thing is what I'm calling right praying. And then the next thing I'm going to mention is verse 8, right thinking. And then the last thing I'll mention will be in verse 9, right living. Those are what we are called to do. And God will give us abundant and ample peace. All right, so let's kind of unpack it. Right praying. I think the difficulty in this, in just practical, is the totality. In other words, be anxious for nothing. And then he says, well, in everything we ought to pray. I think that I am reluctant sometimes to pray about the things that I'm anxious about in totality. It's almost as if I'm tempted to reserve some for my own control. I don't know if you ever do that, or you ever been guilty of that. Maybe I'm just the only one. But here he's saying that you want peace that passes understanding. What do you have to do? Well, I have to, in everything, give thanks and make my request known to God. It's like that song we sing, "Oh, what peace we often forfeit." Remember that song? When we don't give everything to God in prayer, oh, what peace we often forfeit. Why did you forfeit it? Because you didn't do your part. Y'all with me? And so our part involves praying. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this peace and encourage you to go over just a moment to Jeremiah chapter 17. And I'll go ahead and give you my apology. Well, my sort of apology. We're going to mention these particular verses in the sermon this morning too, so you'll have to hear at least part of it twice. So, if we look at this scene that begins in verse 5, look at Jeremiah chapter 17 and verse 5. He said, "Cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his strength, whose heart departs from the Lord." Let me tell you what he's going to be like. Just let me give you a metaphor. "He shall be like a shrub in the desert and shall not see when good comes, but shall inhabit a parched place." Now, in other words, without. Someone says they're really thirsty. I'm parched. Say that to a teenager and watch him look at you sideways. Parched. The idea is this dry land, this thirsty land. And he's saying it's like a tumbleweed or a shrub in the deserted place that doesn't have the hope. It's verse 6 still. It inhabits this parched place in the wilderness, in a salt land which is not inhabited. Okay, that's this, the one who trusts in himself. Okay, let me make sure I hammer this home. Someone who trusts in themselves or their flesh. Because he said, be anxious for nothing, but in everything, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. In other words, you don't keep any back for yourself. You have to let it go and relinquish it and completely commit to trusting God. That's the difficulty, right? Because we want to trust God, but then we often, if we're honest, we are guilty of trying to manipulate and control and make sure the outcome is how we want it, and it's difficult to completely release. And so he's saying, if you trust in yourself, or you trust in man, or you trust in flesh for your strength, well, this is what it's going to be like. Now, on the opposite, because he starts verse 5 by saying, cursed is the man who does this. Now, on the opposite, verse 7, blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, and whose hope is in the Lord. For he shall be like a tree planted by the water, which spreads out its roots by the river. Listen very carefully. And will not fear when heat comes. Be anxious for nothing. He keeps going to say, but its leaves will be green. Listen. And will not be anxious in the year of drought, nor will cease from yielding fruit. So he's describing the one who's going to trust in himself or trust in man or, try and control the outcome or determine the circumstances or hold on to it. He's like the man that's going to be like the plant out in the desert that's in a dry and thirsty land and has no hope to flourish, to grow, to live, to be vibrant, much less bear fruit. And on the other end of the spectrum, the one who wholly and completely commits and trusts God, I'll tell you what he's like. He's like a tree that you plant by the river. And its roots are going to go deep, and it's going to have this source of vitality and strength and life in the water. And it's going to grow, and it's going to bear fruit. And when the drought comes, that tree's not worried about anything. Why not? Them roots run deep. Listen very carefully, it's tapped into the life source. Go read John chapter 15. There's that description that Jesus is that life source that we are tapped into. He is that living water. He is that source of strength and vitality. Listen, to the extent that we put our trust and faith and hope in it, and we relinquish the control that we so naturally cling to. Saying you want peace? We'll have to address the faith that we give to prayer. Jesus says pray without doubting. In James it talks about the double-minded man who, prays but then doubts. We're told that we'll have wisdom liberally in verse 5 of James 1 if we don't doubt. That's the difficulty. I won't ask you to, admit it or raise your hand, but you ever been worried about something and you pray about it, and then just about the second you say, in Jesus' name, amen, you go right back to worrying about it? You might ask me, well, how long do I pray until I get this peace? I think the key is in that until. It's very difficult. It is an exercise in faith, and it's an exercise in consistency. It's an exercise in diligence. It's an exercise in how long will I pray about this? Until I find peace. In Matthew chapter 6, there's a familiar section that says, do not worry. You know this section well, right? Do not worry about, he starts by saying, don't worry about your life. And then he says, for instance, the food you'll eat, the clothes you'll wear. And then he gives us this encouragement, consider. Consider the ravens, or consider the lilies of the valley, and how, they don't have the luxuries of barns or storehouses or the things that we do, but yet they have everything they need every day, and they're fine. God knows they need those things, and they're taken care of. Same point he makes to us. God knows you need all these things. Just seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and everything will work out as far as these things that you could potentially worry about. And so we have this encouragement to pray in faith, in trust, in totality. And anybody that says that's easy, I would imagine that you are deficient in some way of doing that, because it's not easy. It's difficult to have faith and trust in uncertain circumstances, when fear creeps in. All right, I've been doing all the talking. Let me pause. Your thoughts, questions, comments? So we all want God's peace. We all want this peace that's beyond or surpasses just the understanding. There have been things in my life where I've struggled to make peace with. I don't know if you're there or not. I don't know if you've ever been there or not. But I've had things in my life that I really struggled to come to peace about, to have peace with. And the thing is, interestingly enough, if you pray about it perpetually, even when you think, I'm just be real candid and honest, even when you think, this ain't working, this formula doesn't work, I'm praying about it, but I don't find this peace. It almost seems like, in my experience, when you get to that point, you're really close to the breakthrough, to getting to the point where you are able to have peace. And you keep praying, and you keep praying, and you keep praying, and then, I don't understand it, but I've come to peace about that situation. I may not like the outcome. I may have not gotten the answer I'd hoped for. It may have not worked out exactly like I wanted. Maybe I didn't get a yes about something specific, but I've gotten to a point where, I think the key word is acceptance. Acceptance. In Job chapter 2 and verse 10, Job told his wife, I'm loose paraphrase, we've accepted good from God. Shall we not also accept adversity? It's that place of acceptance. How do you not be anxious in Job's scenario? How do you not be anxious if you're Job? If all of a sudden, almost overnight, your world's turned completely upside down. You have lost all of your children in dramatic circumstances. You've lost your wealth. You've lost a great portion of your health. You've lost the support of your network in the community, your esteem in the community. Your friends aren't even much help to comfort you. And here you are. How do you get to a place of acceptance in that? Where do you find peace? Well, it's attached to your faith. There's peace in believing. Romans chapter 15 reminds us. And so here's this difficulty. But if we want peace, we have to do our part, and part of that is right praying. The next thing, I did want to mention this. If we have this totality, this complete trust, the relinquishing of the desire to control the outcome, and we're willing to, in everything, give thanks and let our requests be made known, we can have a peace that passes all understanding, or surpasses the seeming circumstances and what a normal response would be. And then we have this hope to have a guard of our heart and our mind. This guard literally can be translated a garrison of troops. And the idea is that we have a protection, a buffer, a hedge. And, we could see other occasions where Paul used this word to describe literal guards. But what's interesting, and I will encourage you, if you have your Bible, go over to 1 Peter chapter 1 quickly. And then we'll pick up and talk about right thinking. All right, go ahead. What's your question?
Well, it's not a question really, but I think sometimes we focus on all the good. When we think about God and His blessings and everything, it's all good, but we forget about the fact that we also have to accept from Him as well.
Oh, you mean there are folks that have the misconception that if I'm a Christian that I have a life full of prosperity and blessings and no. Yes, there is a pervasive thought within a lot of the preaching, especially what you may see on television or other social media avenues, to suggest, hey, look, it's nothing, but gravy train and biscuit wheels for the Christian. I mean, it's just everything's going to be great, and you're going to be truly blessed and highly favored, and you just name it and claim it, and if you didn't, name it and claim it and get it, it's your faith problem, and all of these unbiblical approaches to suggesting that prosperity is directly tied to your faith. Well, there are too many examples to the contrary to mention. I'll give you one. Just look at the life of Paul. Go read 2 Corinthians around chapter 11, read all the stuff he went through, and then get to chapter 12 and see where he finds himself in that particular predicament of the thorn in the flesh. The point being, we're going to face adversity. God never promised that if you're a Christian, you won't face adversity or the challenges that have come as the curse of the fall back to Genesis 3, or the nature of free will. People are at their free will to do all kinds of horrible, mean things to you, to hurt you, and the various things that could happen to any of us. Adversity. Man born of woman is few a days and full of trouble. Life isn't easy. And so we're reminded that we have a hope, though, and we can tap into a peace. Maybe I should ask this, although I think it's obvious. This peace that we're under the discussion of in Philippians 4, is it for now or eternally? And don't say yes. Well, yes, but I think he's describing now. Like, okay, so am I going to pray? When I get to heaven, am I going to pray? No prayers in heaven. I'm not praying in heaven. I have access. He will be their God, and He will dwell among them. I don't have to pray. Okay, well, is right living in the world that, like we'll talk about, or my thinking process that I'm doing now, is that the same in heaven? Man, I sure hope not. At last I read, sin's going to be on the outside. I don't have to deal with that, right? So I don't have to deal with sin. I don't have to deal with the negativity and the world and the influence of the devil and the things that infiltrate my thought. All that stuff I let go. Man, this is talking about peace that we can have now. Okay, so let's go back to 1 Peter for just a moment. This guard concept, this being kept or preserved. To guard what, incidentally? Your heart and your mind. Well, we'll talk a lot about thoughts. That's what the mind is. But the heart is associated with a variety of things, including your thoughts, as a man thinks in his heart. But primarily, your emotions. Can I ask you a question? Is anxiety an emotion? Is it a feeling? Be anxious for nothing. He wants to guard your heart and your mind from what? From the negative influences that will rob you of your peace. All right, so go over quickly to 1 Peter, and we'll go right back to Philippians. Look at 1 Peter chapter 1, and let's back up to verse 3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to His abundant mercy has begotten us again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled that does not fade away, received in heaven for you. Now we're going to find our same word for guard in the next verse. Who are kept or guarded by the power of God. Whose part's that? The power of God. Whose part's that? Softball, right down the middle. Okay, thank you. All right, the next word, or two words rather. Kept by the power of God, or guarded by the power of God. Through faith. Whose part's that? Ours. Okay, so what's he saying? God is able to keep, preserve, protect, build a garrison, a hedge around, but we have to do our part. He says, I've got this power to keep, to preserve, to protect, to build a hedge around. But we play a part in that too. So, He will guard our hearts and our minds. But we can circumvent that. We can truncate that. We can dilute that. We have an obligation and responsibility. He built the wall, if you will, but we can jump over it if we want to. All right. So, right praying, I'm calling it. The next thing I'm going to mention is right thinking. And that's verse 8. And verse 8 basically says, meditate on these things. I look at this list as categorical. These are like categories. Not exhaustive, but the idea is, I think about it like this. If you think about a filter, if you run something through a filter, it's supposed to filter out all the impurities, right? And then you're filtering out things you don't want. And you can think about, sifting wheat or any number of ways that you would do this. But you filter, you go through the filter, and on the other end, it's just what you want. And you've filtered out everything else. Make sense? And so when I look at that in verse 8, I see a filter. Okay? Is it true? Nope, not true. Guess what happens? The filter doesn't let that one through. Are y'all with me? These are my thoughts that I'm trying to protect and preserve. My mind. So I can keep that guard or that garrison or that protection around it. So what? So I won't have anxiety. Because I don't want it. I've had anxiety. I don't like it. Are y'all with me? And so what I do is, here's the filter. Okay, is it true? You ever entertain thoughts that aren't true? I think that's the biggest culprit. Now, it may be coincidental that in this list it's mentioned first, but I think that's the most important one. Most of people's anxious thoughts are not grounded in truth. And, sadly, they're not challenged on the validity of their truth. In other words, we just let those thoughts kick around and, go in our head. Have you ever been guilty of exaggerating circumstances or making hypothetical scenarios in your head? Man, I mean, it could be one thing, something happens. I remember this years ago. I had, I was young, I was broke, I had a variety of insecurities. I didn't have much money at all. And I was like, well, if this happens and I make a mistake and mess up, I might get fired. And if I get fired, I won't be able to pay my rent. If I can't pay my rent, I'll be homeless. And if I'm homeless, I'll lose all my teeth. I'll go through all these things. And I went from gainfully employed, healthy, I went all the way to homeless and toothless. And it only took me about 3 seconds, right? And so before you get homeless and toothless and you're thinking, you need to stop, analyze, challenge those thoughts, run it through the filter, and the first thing you say is that true? You ever have thoughts that are so negative about yourself? Now, maybe you are blessed and this doesn't happen to you. Maybe you had an ideal growing up and maybe you've trained yourself and you're great at this. But I'm often challenged by negative labeling to myself. Oh, you're no good. I can still remember a teacher telling me I wasn't college material. I don't reckon I'll ever forget it. I'm nearly 50 years old. I can still remember the teacher said, you're not college material. Now, I do have 3 college degrees, but I just say that for the sake of she was wrong. But I did entertain that and other things that were said to me and labels that were placed on me. You run a few minutes late, you say, well, I'm always late, or I'm such an idiot, and all these things. I don't know what your internal dialogue is like, but if you're like most people on average, it's a high percentage of it is negative. And often that negativity is pointed at yourself. And so I'm asking you, okay, he said meditate on these things, right? Verse 8, meditate on these things. What things? Number 1, things that are true. So run it through that filter. And then, is this a pure thought? Well, have you ever had a thought that you're embarrassed about? Maybe even about somebody else. I mean, you're sitting there talking to them, all of a sudden you have an embarrassing thought run through your head. Does that make you a bad person? Well, no, not necessarily. You had that bad thought. Maybe it wasn't noble or kind or just, didn't run through this filter. What do you do with that? Do you beat yourself up or you just say, nope, I'm not entertaining that. I'm bringing that thought into captivity. I'm not going to entertain that at all. That's going to go right out of here. I'm not going to sit here and meditate on that. And so that's the challenge of verse 8. It's saying, okay, is this true? Is it noble? Is it just? Is it pure? Is it lovely? Is it of a good report? Is it virtuous? Is it praiseworthy? And what you have to do is say, are the things that I'm engaging and entertaining in, listen, externally and internally going through this filter? Now, I'm not going, people don't like it when I say this. I'm only trying to illustrate a point, and I'm not trying to replace my judgment for yours, and I'm not saying it's wrong, but I don't watch the news. I stay away from it because I stay away from social media too. I look at both of those as external things, and in my opinion, when I run them through this filter, it filters out a vast percentage of all that stuff. And so I'm carefully trying to do my part, right? So what's God's part? I'll give you peace that surpasses all understanding. It'll guard your heart where your emotions are. It'll guard your mind where your thoughts are. But you have some obligation to run these thoughts through this filter. And if everything you get externally, whether it's social media or the internet or TV, listen, or the people you choose in your life, if those don't run through this filter, are you really doing your part to get the peace that passes understanding? Or your internal dialogue, which is the most difficult. I mean, independent of negative circumstances, you can still have a battleground in your mind. And you have to, am I running these thoughts today? Am I doing my part? Okay, let me see if I can ask it like this. If we don't have peace, is it our fault or God's fault? Yeah. Has God done His part, I guess is what I'm asking. Is He offering to say, okay, here's what you do. You know, and again, this isn't the exhaustive list in the whole Bible about how you have peace. There are plenty of times that this subject is discussed, and we have a part to play in it. It's attached to our faith, for instance, as if we think about, transcending just this world. Let's look at a couple of verses real quick. Will somebody read Isaiah 26 and verse 3 for us? Isaiah chapter 26 and verse 3. Very simple, very compact statement.
Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusteth in thee.
Who does this individual trust in? Himself, his flesh, kind of like that tree. Remember, are you a shrub through the desert, parched? Or are you a tree planted by the water who flourishes, and when drought comes, you're not worried about it because you've done tapped your roots in deep and you're at ease? But read the verse one more time, Miss Iris.
Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusteth in thee.
Okay, so listen. God's part, our part. God will keep us in peace. Is He able to do that? Is there any deficiency in His ability to give us peace? No. What do we have to do, Miss Iris, according to that verse? Keep our mind fixed on Him. Let me ask you a question. Is that hard or easy? It's very hard. Why is it hard? Distractions, domestic responsibilities, difficulties, things I willingly go worry about. But if our mind is fixed on Him, which is difficult, it takes self-control, discipline, intentionality, being proactive instead of reactive, then He'll do His part to give us this peace. Right.
You look at the maturity of Peter, and when he tried to walk on the water, and then he got distracted by the waves and began to drown and got Jesus killed. And then you look at him later on in his life, towards the end of his life, where he was, like we were talking about, like in last week, the week after, or about the angel actually had to wake him up.
Yeah.
Because he was so at peace.
Yeah.
And he just believed that he would not die, even though there had no evidence, physical and outside evidence that what Herod had planned to do to him was not going to happen the next day.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite scenes, If you ask 10 people, give me, 5 things from the life of Peter that you remember from the Bible, I'd say most folks would remember 5 negative things, right? I mean, most folks. And I'm probably all guilty of that, but one of my favorite things about Peter is that scene in Acts 12 where he slept the night before he was confident the goal and intention of the ruling power was to kill him. And he slept. That's peace, independent of the circumstances, based upon, did Peter do his part? Sure. You reckon he was thinking right when he was able to go to sleep? I believe so. You think he prayed about it? Although we don't know, it doesn't say in the text. We know the whole church was gathered praying. I'd like to think, I'm pretty confident he was. And was he living right? Now that's the next thing that we'll look at in just a moment. Yes. So he'd done his part. Was he trusting in himself to get out of this situation? Or was he trusting in God? He'll deliver me. See, he was doing his part, and God provided his part. The conditional obligations. All right, let's quickly mention Romans chapter 8, and then we'll look at the last component of this, which is very important, incidentally. I mean, we don't want to de-emphasize our obligation to live righteously in condition with the blessings. But first, Romans 8. And I'll give you a very loose and simple paraphrase of the verses. To be carnally minded or fleshly minded is death. However, to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Your peace requires that you be able to direct your mind. You're in control of your mind. As crazy and chaotic as it may feel, you are able to be in control of your mind. You are the drill sergeant over your own mind. Now, it is a discipline that is difficult, but we can choose to think on things that are spiritual. And in doing so, we find peace. What does it take to think about things that are spiritual? What does it demand of you? It's a softball. Faith. You can't see. These things are invisible. That's a point that's made over and over again. The things that are visible are things that we can see and touch and taste. They're made of atoms. They're put together and they're in time and space. But the things that we can't see, the things that are invisible, the spiritual realm that coexists with our realm, the eternal nature of God, to exist before there ever was a time, space, and material universe. To think spiritually takes faith. And to the extent that we're willing to do that and harness in our thinking, filter it through this filter that we have categorically here in Philippians 4 and verse 8, we will find what? Peace. I can't do anything about the circumstances of my life, necessarily. I know I have free will, and certainly I can, but okay, think about Ecclesiastes 3. There's a time for war and a time for peace. I'll take peace all the time. No, there's a time for weeping, and there's a time for joy. I'll just take all joy, no weeping, thank you. I mean, it's like going to Burger King. No, you're going to have both. I can't control that. But I can keep peace through whatever comes through life if I'll do this. Now, that doesn't mean I won't have episodes where my peace is rattled, and I'm not saying it's easy. And it's a discipline. But oftentimes we forfeit the peace because we don't give attention to the part that we play. All right, let's talk about, well, we're about to run out of time. Let me see if there are questions, comments, or thoughts before we entertain this final one. The next thing we see is in verse 9, and I do want to mention this. In verse 9, he says, the things which you learned and received and heard and saw in me, I don't worry about them. No, he says, these do, and the God of peace will be with you. In other words, he says, here's what you need to do in terms of prayer. Here's what you need to do in terms of thinking. And here's what you need to do in terms of your life, living, your Christian walk, if you will. Let's go over quickly to Isaiah and the time that we have, and we'll start in chapter 32, but we're going to run out of time. Look at Isaiah chapter 32 with me. I want to back up to verse 16 there. Does my living impact the availability of God's peace? And the answer is certainly yes. Look at verse 16 of verse 32. Then justice will dwell in the wilderness, and righteous remain in a fruitful field. A very similar illustration that we looked at back in Isaiah 17, or Jeremiah 17 rather. But listen to verse 17. The work of righteousness will be peace, and the effect of righteousness, quietness and assurance forever. My people will dwell in peaceful habitation, in secure dwelling, and in quiet resting places, though hail comes down on the forest and the city is brought low in humiliation. Blessed are you who sow beside all waters, who send out freely the feet of the ox and the donkey. We'll talk more about these verses and some other verses here in this basic section of Isaiah. But the point is, the righteous and those who are living righteous are going to receive the blessing. So what do I have to do to get the peace that passes understanding? Well, I have to give attention to my prayer life, my thoughts, and my righteous living. All right, we'll pick up there, talk a little more about that, the Lord willing, next week. Appreciate your attention.